The first light of dawn had not yet reached the limestone cliffs when I opened my eyes on the rough linen mat inside our workers' village. The cool desert air would disappear within an hour, so everyone rose before sunrise. My name is Mena, and I have worked on the Great Pyramid for 7 years. Some people in distant lands may one day believe that slaves built these monuments, but I know the truth because I live it every day. I am a paid worker of the king, and my family receives grain, onions, dried fish, and beer in return for my labor. The work is difficult, but it is honorable because we believe we are helping our divine ruler prepare for eternity. I washed my face with water from a clay jar and quietly thanked the gods for another morning. My wife handed me a small loaf of coarse bread and a bundle of onions wrapped in linen. She smiled, though she worried about the dangers of my work. Every day someone could slip on loose gravel, strain a muscle while pulling heavy stone, or suffer from the burning sun. Before leaving, I kissed the heads of my sleeping children and promised to return before nightfall. Outside, hundreds of workers were already walking through the dusty streets toward the gathering place. Some carried wooden mallets, others held copper chisels that needed sharpening, while many simply brought ropes made from twisted plant fibers. The smell of baking bread mixed with the scent of damp earth from the nearby canals where farmers had finished the flood season. During the Nile's annual inundation, many farmers became pyramid workers because their fields were underwater. They joined skilled builders like me, creating a huge workforce organized into teams. Every group had its own leader, scribes, and overseers who kept careful records of attendance and supplies. As the eastern horizon slowly turned orange, a priest appeared beside a small shrine. He burned incense and offered a short prayer to Ra, asking the sun god to watch over us. Even the strongest workers fell silent during the ceremony. We believed every stone we lifted was seen by the gods themselves. After the prayer ended, the overseers called our names from long papyrus lists. The scribes dipped their reed pens into black ink and marked who had arrived. No one wanted to be absent without a good reason because each worker depended on his daily rations. Once everyone was counted, our teams marched toward the massive construction site. The pyramid towered above us like a mountain created by human hands. Thousands of limestone blocks reflected the growing sunlight, making the monument appear almost golden. Ramps stretched upward along its sides, crowded with men hauling stones, shouting commands, and singing rhythmic work songs to keep everyone pulling together. The air echoed with the sound of wooden sledges scraping over wet sand, copper tools striking stone, and foremen giving instructions. Even after 7 years, the sight still filled me with awe. I knew I was only one worker among thousands, yet every stone I helped move would remain long after my own life ended. Taking a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the thick hauling rope, looked toward the rising sun, and stepped forward to begin another demanding day beneath the shadow of the Great Pyramid. As soon as the morning roll call ended, my crew received its assignment from the foreman. Today we would move one of the large limestone blocks from the lower staging area to the upper construction ramp. Each stone weighed more than 2 men could imagine lifting, so strength alone was never enough. We depended on planning, teamwork, and patience. The block rested on a heavy wooden sledge with thick runners polished smooth from years of use. Before we began, another team poured water onto the sand in front of the sledge. The damp sand reduced friction and allowed the runners to slide more easily across the ground. Our rope was as thick as my wrist, woven carefully from strong plant fibers. Nearly 40 men took their places along its length. I wrapped the rope around my forearm, planted my feet firmly, and waited for the signal. The foreman raised a wooden staff into the air. Beside him stood a drummer whose only task was to keep our movements together. The steady rhythm of the drum became the heartbeat of our labor. At the first beat we leaned forward. At the second we tightened the rope. At the third we pulled with every muscle in our bodies. The sledge groaned, the rope stretched, and for a brief moment nothing happened. Then the massive stone slowly began to move. Dust rose beneath our feet while the wet sand darkened beneath the runners. Every few steps the men carrying water hurried ahead and poured another layer across the path. Without them the sledge would slow to a stop, and we would waste precious energy. We spoke very little because breathing itself demanded effort. Instead we sang short work chants that matched the drummer's rhythm. The songs were simple, repeating the same lines again and again, but they helped every man pull at exactly the same moment. If one worker lost the rhythm, the entire team felt the strain. As the sun climbed higher, sweat covered our skin and soaked our linen kilts. The cool air of dawn disappeared, replaced by heat reflecting from the pale stone beneath our feet. I could feel the rough rope burning against my palms despite the leather strips wrapped around my hands. One younger worker stumbled on a loose rock and nearly fell beneath the moving sledge. Two older men immediately grabbed him and pulled him clear before disaster struck. No one shouted at him. We all understood that exhaustion could overcome even the strongest laborer. When we finally reached the beginning of the great ramp, we paused to catch our breath. The climb ahead would be even harder. The ramp rose steadily toward the growing pyramid, supported by packed earth, limestone chips, and mud bricks. From below it looked endless. Teams farther up the slope appeared as tiny figures against the bright sky, pulling stones that seemed no larger than toys from where we stood. Our foreman inspected the ropes, making sure none had begun to fray. A broken rope on the ramp could send a stone crashing downward, destroying months of work and taking many lives. Satisfied that everything remained secure, he nodded once. Again the drum began its slow rhythm. Again we leaned into the rope. The climb demanded every bit of strength we possessed. My legs trembled with effort, and my shoulders felt as though fire burned inside them. Yet every time I looked upward, I reminded myself why we endured such hardship. Each stone brought the pyramid one step closer to completion. Long after our names were forgotten, travelers would gaze upon this monument and wonder how ordinary men had achieved something so extraordinary. They would never hear our songs or know our faces, but hidden within every layer of stone would remain the silent proof of our determination. Our skill, and the countless days we spent working together beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. By the way, guys, I'd be grateful if you could like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now let's get back to the story. By the time our team reached the working platform, the sun had climbed high into the cloudless sky. The hardest part of hauling the stone was behind us, but another kind of labor was about to begin. A pyramid was not built simply by piling blocks on top of one another. Every stone had to fit so precisely that even the thinnest blade could barely slide between neighboring surfaces. The master builders often reminded us that strength raised the stones, but skill allowed the pyramid to stand forever. We carefully positioned the sledge beside the place where the new block would rest. The foreman ordered us to remain still while the stone masons examined it. Several experienced craftsmen walked around the block with wooden measuring rods, plumb lines, and smooth leveling tools. They studied every edge under the bright sunlight. One mason gently tapped the limestone with a wooden mallet and listened to the sound it produced. He could recognize hidden cracks by ear, something I had always admired. Another craftsman marked tiny lines across the surface using red ochre mixed with water. These marks showed exactly where small pieces had to be trimmed away before the block could be placed beside the others. Their hands moved slowly and confidently, wasting neither effort nor material. Nearby, the sharp ring of copper chisels echoed across the construction site. Teams of stone cutters chipped away at rough surfaces while helpers constantly sharpened the soft copper tools against hard stone. Copper dulled quickly when cutting limestone, so sharpening was almost as important as carving itself. Broken tools were collected carefully because metal was valuable and nothing useful was thrown away. I watched an older craftsman named Hori, whose beard had already turned white, shape the corner of a block with astonishing patience. Each strike seemed gentle, yet after many careful blows the rough edge became perfectly straight. He often said that a worker who rushed a single stone could create problems for 100 more above it. His words stayed with me whenever I felt tempted to hurry. Once the block had been trimmed, our crew received another command. Thick wooden levers were placed beneath one side of the stone while other workers positioned rounded wooden rollers and small support blocks nearby. The foreman counted aloud. Together we pushed the long levers downward. The enormous block rose only a few fingers above the platform, but that tiny movement allowed other men to slide support stones beneath it. We repeated the process again and again. Lift. Support. Shift. Lift. Support. Shift. The work demanded complete trust because every man depended upon the others. One careless movement could crush a foot or trap a hand forever. Above us, scribes sat beneath simple linen shelters to escape the burning sun. They recorded everything happening on the site. They noted how many stones arrived, which crews completed their assignments, how many tools needed repair, and how many workers required medical attention. Their writing ensured that food, supplies, and labor remained organized across this enormous project. Sometimes I wondered whether future generations would ever read their records and discover the names of ordinary men like us. During a short pause, I looked down from the platform toward the workers' village far below. The Nile shimmered in the distance like a ribbon of polished bronze. Boats moved slowly along its waters, carrying more limestone from distant quarries and bringing grain, vegetables, wood, and fresh supplies. Everything depended upon the great river. Without the Nile there would be no harvest, no villages, no workers, and certainly no pyramid. The monument rising beneath my feet was not built by a single king alone. It was built by farmers, sailors, quarrymen, rope makers, scribes, priests, cooks, craftsmen, and thousands of laborers whose efforts joined together like the carefully fitted stones themselves. As the foreman finally announced that our block rested perfectly in its place, a quiet smile spread across our exhausted faces. We allowed ourselves only a brief moment of pride before another empty sledge arrived beside us. The next stone was already waiting below, and the pyramid demanded that our work continue without delay. When the sun stood almost directly above our heads, the foreman finally ordered a break. The command spread across the construction site faster than any shout. Ropes were laid on the ground, sledges were secured with wooden wedges, and the constant rhythm of hammers and chisels slowly faded into silence. For a short time, the Great Pyramid seemed almost peaceful. We gathered beneath simple shelters made from wooden poles and woven reeds. They offered little protection from the fierce Egyptian heat, but even a patch of shade felt like a gift after hours of working under the blazing sky. I lowered myself onto a flat limestone block and stretched my aching back. Every muscle in my body reminded me of the morning's labor. My shoulders throbbed, my hands were covered with fresh blisters, and fine white dust clung to every fold of my skin. One of the younger workers laughed as he looked at our faces. "We all look like statues carved from limestone," he joked. We laughed with him, grateful for a moment when no one expected us to pull another stone. Soon the food baskets arrived from the village. Each crew received its daily rations according to the records kept by the scribes. The meal was simple but filling. Thick loaves of coarse bread were passed from hand to hand. Bowls of onions, garlic, dried fish, and dates were shared among the men. Clay jars filled with beer stood in the center of each group. Our beer was not like the strong drink wealthy nobles enjoyed during feasts. It was thick, nutritious, and made from barley. It satisfied hunger almost as much as thirst, making it an important part of every worker's diet. I tore off a piece of bread, dipped it into a bowl of crushed beans, and ate slowly. After hours of hard labor, even the simplest meal tasted wonderful. Around me the conversations grew lively. Some men spoke about their families waiting in the workers' village. Others discussed the latest shipment of fine limestone that had arrived from the quarries across the Nile. One worker proudly announced that his wife had given birth to a healthy daughter the previous evening. The entire crew congratulated him, and someone promised to carve the child a small wooden toy after work. Moments like these reminded us that life existed beyond the endless stones surrounding us. Nearby, a team of physicians moved quietly among the resting workers. Egyptian healers were respected men with surprising knowledge. They examined swollen joints, wrapped injured wrists with clean linen bandages, and applied ointments made from honey, animal fat, and medicinal plants. Honey was especially valuable because it helped keep wounds clean. A worker who had strained his ankle during the morning climb was told to rest for several days. No one mocked him for the injury. Everyone understood that even the strongest laborer could become hurt on such a demanding site. As I finished my meal, I noticed one of the temple priests walking along the edge of the platform. He carried a small statue of the god Ptah, the patron of craftsmen and builders. Some workers bowed their heads as he passed, quietly asking for steady hands and protection from accidents. Others whispered prayers to Ra or to Hathor for the safety of their families. Faith was woven into every part of our lives. We believed the gods watched our efforts just as carefully as the overseers did. After eating, many workers stretched out in the shade for a few precious moments of rest. Some closed their eyes without falling asleep, listening to the distant cries of birds flying over the Nile. Others repaired sandals, mended torn clothing, or rubbed oil into sore muscles. I took out the small amulet my mother had given me years earlier. It was carved in the shape of the Eye of Horus and hung from a worn leather cord around my neck. I held it tightly for a moment, remembering her words that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to keep working despite it. Before long, the foreman struck a bronze bell, its clear sound echoing across the construction site. Conversations ended almost immediately. Workers stood, brushed the dust from their linen kilts, and reached once more for ropes, levers, and tools. The brief comfort of shade and food was over. The afternoon awaited us. And with it another long struggle against the weight of stone, the heat of the desert, and the relentless demand to build a monument that would outlive every one of us. The afternoon always felt longer than the morning. The heat became heavier, the air shimmered above the pale limestone, and every movement demanded greater determination. Yet this was also the time when the overseers paid their closest attention. They believed that tired workers were more likely to make costly mistakes, and a single mistake on the pyramid could affect hundreds of stones placed above it. As our crew prepared to move another block into position, word spread quickly that the chief overseer was climbing the ramp. His visits were never announced far in advance. He preferred to see the work exactly as it was, without anyone having time to hide carelessness or disorder. Soon he appeared. Walking steadily despite the steep slope, accompanied by two scribes carrying rolled papyrus scrolls and reed pens. His linen robe was cleaner than ours, but his sandals were covered in the same white dust. He greeted several foremen by name before beginning his inspection. That simple gesture earned him respect. A man who remembered names was more likely to remember the people behind the work. He stopped beside a newly placed stone and ran his hand slowly across the narrow joint between two blocks. His fingers searched for uneven edges that even the eye might miss. Satisfied, he nodded without saying a word. Then he checked the wooden levers stacked nearby. One had developed a long crack after months of heavy use. He ordered it replaced immediately. "A broken tool can break a man," he said calmly. No one argued. We had all seen accidents caused by worn ropes, damaged sledges, or weakened timber. The pyramid demanded constant maintenance not only of stone, but also of every tool used to raise it. The scribes carefully recorded his observations. Every repair, every replacement, every delay found its way onto papyrus. Nothing escaped their attention. One young scribe paused beside our crew and asked our foreman how many stones we had moved since sunrise. The answer was written down in neat columns of black ink. Another scribe counted the remaining ropes and noted which copper chisels needed sharpening before the next day's work. Their records seemed endless, but without them such a vast project would quickly fall into confusion. As the inspection continued, a sudden shout echoed from farther up the ramp. Every worker froze instinctively. A hauling rope had slipped from its wooden anchor, causing a loaded sledge to slide backward several hand lengths. Fortunately, the workers controlling the safety ropes reacted immediately. They drove thick wooden stakes into the ground and tightened the secondary lines before the stone gathered dangerous speed. Dust filled the air as dozens of men rushed to stabilize the load. Within moments the situation was under control. No one had been injured, but everyone's heart was pounding. The chief overseer hurried to the scene. Instead of shouting in anger, he questioned each foreman carefully, trying to understand exactly what had happened. After examining the anchor point, he concluded that one of the wooden pegs had loosened in the dry ground. He ordered additional anchors to be installed along that section of the ramp before any more stones were moved. The lesson was clear. Preventing accidents mattered more than assigning blame. We returned to work with renewed caution. Every knot was checked twice. Every rope was inspected before another pull began. As we leaned together against the hauling line once again, I realized how much trust existed among us. My safety depended upon the worker behind me gripping the rope firmly. His safety depended upon the carpenter who had shaped the wooden sledge months earlier. The carpenter relied upon the lumber brought by distant traders, while the traders depended upon sailors navigating the Nile. Even the smallest task became part of something much larger. Standing beside the growing pyramid, it was impossible to believe that one man alone could ever build such a monument. It rose because thousands of people, each with different skills and responsibilities, worked together day after day with remarkable discipline. As the chief overseer finished his inspection and disappeared down the ramp, the sounds of labor gradually returned. The rhythmic songs began again. Copper rang against limestone. Sledges creaked across damp sand. The pyramid continued its slow ascent toward the heavens, one carefully measured stone at a time, and I once again tightened my grip on the rope, ready to add my small part to a work that seemed destined to outlast the memory of us all. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the fierce heat began to soften. The sun, which had punished us from high above all day, now drifted toward the western desert. Long shadows stretched across the ramps and unfinished terraces of the pyramid, making the enormous structure seem even larger than before. The brilliant white limestone reflected the golden light, and for a few quiet moments the monument appeared to glow as if the gods themselves had touched its surface. We all noticed the change in the light because it meant the end of another demanding day was approaching. No one became careless simply because sunset was near. In fact, the foreman often reminded us that fatigue made the final hour the most dangerous. We continued working with steady concentration, guiding another stone into its assigned place. The master mason checked the alignment one final time with his plumb line. After several careful adjustments using wooden levers, he smiled with satisfaction. "It is true," he said quietly. Those simple words brought relief to everyone in our crew. Another block had become part of the pyramid forever. Soon the signal horn echoed across the construction site. Its deep note rolled over the limestone cliffs and down toward the workers' village. One by one, the sounds of labor faded. Hammers stopped striking. Chisels were gathered into baskets. Ropes were coiled neatly instead of being left scattered across the ground. Every tool was counted before we left because replacing lost equipment required valuable time and precious materials. The scribes sat once again with their papyrus scrolls, recording how many crews had completed their assignments and noting any injuries or damaged tools. Each foreman reported directly to them before dismissing his workers. Order was as important at the end of the day as it had been at the beginning. Before climbing down from the upper platform, I turned to look across the landscape. The Nile shimmered beneath the orange sky, winding through fields that were slowly returning to life after the flood season. Palm trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. Small boats drifted toward the riverbank, their sails glowing in the fading sunlight. Beyond the fertile valley stretched the endless desert, silent and unchanged. Between those two worlds stood the pyramid, rising higher with every passing month. It felt strange to think that each day's progress seemed so small while the monument itself continued to grow into something almost unimaginable. The walk back to the village was quieter than our march in the morning. Few men had enough energy left for long conversations. We walked slowly, our sandals leaving fresh footprints in the dusty path. My shoulders still ached from pulling ropes, and my hands felt stiff despite the cool evening air. Dust covered every part of my body. It settled inside my hair, beneath my fingernails, and deep within the folds of my linen kilt. Yet I no longer noticed it. The white dust had become part of my life, just as familiar as the sound of birds flying over the Nile or the smell of fresh bread baking before dawn. As we entered the village, the atmosphere changed completely. Children ran between the narrow streets, laughing as they played with balls made from tightly wrapped cloth. Women prepared the evening meal outside their homes while smoke drifted gently upward from clay ovens. The scent of baking bread mixed with roasted fish, lentils, herbs, and onions filled the air. Elderly men sat together sharing stories about earlier building projects, arguing cheerfully over which pharaoh had ordered the greatest temples. Life continued with warmth and laughter despite the exhausting work that filled our days. When I reached my house, my youngest son spotted me from across the courtyard and ran toward me with a broad smile. He wrapped his small arms around my dusty legs without caring how dirty my clothes were. My daughter proudly showed me a little bird she had shaped from river clay while I had been away. My wife welcomed me with cool water for washing and a simple evening meal of bread, vegetables, beans, and fresh dates. We sat together on woven mats beneath the open sky as darkness slowly settled over the village. The stars appeared one by one, brighter than any lamp could ever be. During dinner, my children asked endless questions about the pyramid. They wanted to know how high it had become, whether the stones were as heavy as elephants, and if I had spoken to the master builders. I answered each question patiently, sometimes exaggerating just enough to make them laugh. Their excitement reminded me that they did not see only the hardship of my work. To them, I was helping create something magnificent. My wife listened quietly, occasionally placing another piece of bread into my hand because she knew how much strength I had spent that day. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, I stepped outside once more. In the distance, the pyramid stood beneath the moonlight, its unfinished silhouette rising above the desert like a giant staircase reaching toward the heavens. Even at night, small groups of guards and craftsmen remained on duty, protecting tools, supplies, and the precious work already completed. I watched the monument for several minutes in complete silence. Every sunrise demanded our labor, and every sunset carried away another day of our lives. Yet the pyramid continued to rise while we slowly grew older. I wondered whether anyone centuries from now would think about the ordinary workers who had sweated beneath the Egyptian sun, laughed together during their meals, returned home to their families each evening, and given their strength to a dream carved from stone. With that thought warming my heart, I returned inside my home, lay down beside my sleeping family, and closed my eyes, knowing that before the next sunrise another day beneath the shadow of the Great Pyramid would begin once again. Before the first light reached the horizon, our foreman surprised us with different orders. Instead of hauling stones already waiting beside the pyramid, several members of our crew would travel to the quarry where fresh limestone blocks were cut from the cliffs. I had visited the quarry many times before, yet every journey reminded me that the pyramid truly began there rather than at the construction site. Without the tireless work of the quarrymen, no ramps, ropes, or skilled builders could continue their labor. We gathered our tools, filled our water jars, and followed a narrow path that wound along the edge of the desert. The air was cool enough to make the walk pleasant, and the silence of the early morning was broken only by our footsteps and the occasional cry of a desert bird searching for food among the rocks. As the sun slowly appeared above the eastern horizon, the pale cliffs ahead began to glow with soft shades of gold and pink. Soon we reached the quarry, where the peaceful morning disappeared beneath the sounds of relentless work. Copper chisels struck limestone with sharp metallic echoes that bounced from one cliff to another. Wooden mallets rose and fell in steady rhythm. Clouds of white dust drifted through the air, settling over workers until their skin and clothing blended with the color of the stone itself. The quarry seemed like a living creature that never truly slept. Every day it surrendered another part of the mountain so the pyramid could continue to rise. The master quarryman welcomed our foreman and immediately showed us the section where new blocks were being prepared. Before any cutting began, experienced surveyors measured the rock face carefully with cords, straightedges, and wooden squares. They marked precise lines using red pigment, ensuring that each block would have the correct dimensions before a single strike was made. Wasting stone meant wasting countless hours of labor, so accuracy was valued as highly as strength. I joined a team responsible for separating one large block from the cliff. First we used copper chisels to carve deep grooves along the marked lines. The work demanded patience because copper was softer than the limestone itself and required frequent sharpening. Nearby, other craftsmen sat beside grinding stones, restoring dull edges as quickly as possible so fresh tools could replace worn ones without delay. Once the grooves were deep enough, wooden wedges were hammered into narrow slots cut beneath the block. Buckets of water were then poured over the dry wood. Slowly the wedges absorbed the moisture and expanded with tremendous force. Tiny cracks spread through the limestone with faint popping sounds. We all stepped back and watched carefully. At last a deep crack echoed across the quarry, and the enormous block separated cleanly from the cliff face. Even after witnessing this process many times, I still admired how simple pieces of wood and water could overcome solid rock. The newly freed stone rested on a prepared bed of sand while craftsmen inspected every surface. Small flaws were removed immediately before the block ever reached a sledge. A damaged stone carried all the way to the pyramid only to be rejected would waste the efforts of dozens of men. Nearby, teams carved channels that allowed the heavy block to be lowered safely onto thick wooden runners. Every movement was controlled with ropes, levers, and careful commands shouted by experienced foremen. There was no room for haste because one careless moment could shatter months of careful preparation. During our midday meal we rested beneath the shadow of the towering cliff instead of the shelters near the pyramid. The quarry offered little shade, but the stone walls blocked part of the burning wind that swept across the desert. We shared bread, onions, dried fish, and beer while watching another crew prepare a fresh section of rock for cutting. One elderly quarryman told us he had spent more than 30 years working among these cliffs. He smiled proudly and said that although visitors admired the finished pyramid, very few ever thought about the mountain that slowly disappeared to create it. His words stayed with me as I looked at the countless tool marks covering the quarry walls. Every scar on the stone represented the effort of men whose names would probably never be remembered. When our meal ended, we helped load the finished block onto a massive wooden sledge. Thick ropes were fastened securely around it while carpenters checked every joint and support beam one final time. Soon another transport crew would drag this stone across the prepared roads toward the pyramid, where other workers would continue the long journey upward. As we began the walk back to the construction site, I glanced over my shoulder at the quarry one last time. The sounds of chisels and hammers continued without pause. Another block was already being marked, another team was already sharpening tools, and another piece of the ancient cliff was preparing to begin its transformation into part of a monument that future generations would see long after both the quarry and the workers themselves had become memories carried only by the desert wind. The morning began like any other, but there was an unusual excitement in the workers' village. Word had spread the previous evening that the priests had declared a festival in honor of the gods. Although construction would not stop completely, the pace of work would be lighter, allowing everyone to take part in the ceremonies before returning to their duties. Such days reminded us that the pyramid was not merely a royal project but also a sacred undertaking. Every stone we placed was believed to serve both the pharaoh and the divine order that kept Egypt strong. As we gathered before sunrise, the usual sounds of ropes being dragged across the ground and sledges creaking over the sand were joined by the deep notes of ceremonial drums. The priests wore spotless white linen robes, and the fragrance of burning incense drifted through the cool morning air. Workers who normally spoke loudly among themselves became quiet as the procession approached the small shrine near the entrance to the construction site. At its center stood a beautifully carved wooden statue of Ra, the sun god, decorated with fresh flowers and brightly colored ribbons. Behind it other priests carried sacred images of Ta, the protector of craftsmen, and Hathor, who was believed to watch over families, music, and joy. We lowered our heads respectfully while prayers were recited in voices that echoed gently across the desert. The first rays of sunlight appeared just as the ceremony reached its highest moment. The priests raised their hands toward the east, thanking Ra for bringing another day of life to Egypt. Hundreds of workers stood silently together, watching the sun climb above the horizon. In that moment the enormous pyramid behind us seemed less like a construction site and more like a bridge between the earth and the heavens. Even the overseers remained silent until the final prayer had ended. After the ceremony, each crew received small offerings of bread, dates, figs, and fresh beer blessed by the temple. The meal was more generous than usual, and laughter quickly returned to the camp. Musicians arrived carrying simple harps, flutes, and small hand drums. Their cheerful melodies spread through the village while children danced between the houses. For a short while the heavy burden of daily labor seemed to disappear. Men who had spent weeks pulling ropes now clapped their hands to the rhythm of the music, while older women sang songs that many of us had learned as children. The festival reminded everyone that life was meant to include happiness as well as work. Even so, the pyramid could not be ignored for an entire day. Before long the foremen gathered us again, though their expressions were kinder than usual. Our assignment was lighter than on ordinary days. Instead of hauling massive stones up the steep ramps, we focused on preparing materials for the following week. Some workers repaired damaged sledges, replacing cracked wooden beams with freshly carved pieces. Others twisted new ropes from long strands of plant fiber, carefully checking each section for strength. Blacksmiths heated copper tools in small furnaces before hammering their edges back into shape. Carpenters sharpened wooden stakes, while scribes reviewed supply records to ensure enough food and equipment remained for the growing workforce. The entire construction site became a place of maintenance rather than relentless hauling. I spent most of the afternoon helping an elderly rope maker named Nebra. His hands were rough from decades of twisting fibers, yet his movements were calm and precise. He explained that the strongest rope was made not by pulling harder but by keeping every strand under equal tension. As we worked together, he smiled and said that people were much the same. A single worker could accomplish little alone, but hundreds of workers united with the same purpose could move mountains. I thought about his words as I watched new coils of rope grow steadily beside us. They looked ordinary enough, yet every one would soon help lift another stone toward the sky. Before sunset, the priests returned once more to offer a final blessing over the day's work. They thanked the gods for protecting the workers and asked for strength during the days ahead. As the last rays of sunlight touched the upper levels of the pyramid, the limestone glowed with a warm golden color that seemed almost unreal. Everyone stopped for a brief moment to admire it. The monument no longer appeared to be only stone and sand. It seemed alive, changing with every hour of light, reflecting the efforts, hopes, and faith of everyone who labored around it. As we walked back toward the village that evening, the songs from the festival still echoed softly behind us. Tomorrow the ropes would once again become heavy, the sledges would creak beneath enormous blocks, and the foreman would urge us onward with steady voices. But tonight our hearts felt lighter. We had remembered that even in a life filled with exhausting labor, there was still room for celebration, gratitude, friendship, and the quiet belief that the gods watched over every honest hand that helped raise the Great Pyramid toward eternity. When I awoke before dawn, I sensed that the day would be different. The air felt cooler than usual, and even the workers who normally joked during the morning walk spoke in quieter voices. Our foreman had gathered us the previous evening to announce that our crew was about to complete the section of the pyramid we had been building for many months. Hundreds of stones had already passed through our hands, and today we would place the final block of that level. It was only one part of the enormous monument, but to us it represented years of sweat, patience, and determination. As we reached the construction site, the eastern sky slowly filled with pale orange light. The upper platforms were already busy. Stone masons checked measurements, carpenters inspected wooden levers, and scribes prepared fresh sheets of papyrus to record the day's progress. Everyone understood that accuracy mattered more than speed. A single mistake in the final placement could force dozens of stones to be moved again. Our foreman gathered us in a circle before work began. He looked at each of us without speaking for a moment, then simply said, "Today we finish what we started together." No long speech was needed. Every man understood the meaning of those words. The final block had arrived from the quarry several days earlier and had been carefully shaped by the master craftsman. Its smooth sides matched the surrounding stones so perfectly that it almost seemed as though it had always belonged there. Before we touched the hauling ropes, the chief mason examined every surface one last time. He ran his fingertips along the edges, checked the measurements with a wooden square, and nodded with quiet satisfaction. Only then were we given permission to begin. We wrapped the thick ropes around the sledge, tightened every knot, and waited for the foreman's signal. The drummer struck a slow, steady rhythm. We leaned forward together, and the familiar strain returned to our shoulders and legs. The heavy stone began its slow journey across the platform. Every step required complete concentration. No one spoke unless it was necessary. The only sounds were the drum, the scraping of the wooden runners, and the breathing of dozens of determined workers pulling as one. When the stone reached its destination, the work became even more delicate. Wooden levers lifted one side by only a few fingers' width while support blocks were placed beneath it. Then the other side was raised in the same careful way. Bit by bit, the massive block moved closer to its final position. The master mason crouched beside it, watching every movement with the attention of a man carving a precious jewel rather than placing a stone weighing several tons. "A little more," he whispered. We pushed. "Stop." We froze instantly. He checked the alignment again using a plumb line hanging perfectly still in the warm afternoon air. Finally he smiled. "Lower it." Slowly the supports were removed. The stone settled into place with a deep, solid sound that echoed softly across the platform. There was no loud crash, only the quiet certainty of one perfectly fitted block meeting another. For a heartbeat, the entire crew remained silent. Then someone began to clap. Another worker laughed with relief. Soon smiles spread across every dust-covered face. We had completed our section. The foreman shook hands with each member of the crew, something he rarely did during ordinary workdays. Even the chief overseer climbed the ramp to inspect the finished course. He examined the joints between the stones and found nothing to criticize. Instead, he thanked our crew for our discipline and careful workmanship. Hearing praise from a man known for noticing only mistakes filled us with quiet pride. The scribes recorded the completion of the section in their scrolls, carefully writing the date, the crew's name, and the number of stones placed. Our names might never be carved onto the pyramid itself, but somewhere on those rolls of papyrus there would be proof that we had stood here and done our part. That evening our meal was a little richer than usual. The cooks prepared extra bread and roasted fish, and each worker received additional dates and a larger cup of beer. There was no grand celebration, because another section of the pyramid already waited to be built. Still, for one evening we allowed ourselves to feel satisfied. We spoke about the first day we had joined the crew, remembering how inexperienced many of us had been. We laughed about broken sandals, torn ropes, unexpected sandstorms, and the countless times we had ended a day too exhausted to lift even a cup. Those memories, once difficult, had become stories worth telling. The pyramid had not only changed the desert landscape. It had changed us as well, teaching patience, endurance, trust, and the value of working beside people who depended on one another every single day. As darkness settled over the workers' village, I climbed a small hill overlooking the construction site. The moon illuminated the unfinished pyramid with a pale silver light. From a distance the courses of stone resembled giant steps leading toward the stars. I searched for the section our crew had completed that day. Of course, I could no longer distinguish our final block from the hundreds surrounding it. It had become part of something much greater than itself. I realized that this was true for us as well. No single worker could claim the pyramid as his own, yet every worker lived forever within it through his labor. I stood there for a long time in complete silence, grateful that my hands, though rough and scarred, had helped shape a monument that would stand long after my own footprints had disappeared from the desert sand. Many seasons have passed since I first pulled a rope beneath the rising walls of the Great Pyramid. My hair has begun to turn gray, and the strength that once seemed endless now leaves me a little earlier each evening. Younger workers have joined our crews, bringing fresh energy and eager hands. Sometimes they ask me what it was like during the first years of construction, when the pyramid stood only a little higher than a man. I smile whenever I hear their questions because they find it difficult to imagine that the enormous monument before them once began with nothing more than carefully measured ground and a few lines marked in the desert sand. I tell them that every great achievement begins with a single stone placed correctly, followed by another, and then another, until ordinary days become an extraordinary lifetime. Today our work ended earlier than usual. The chief builders gathered all the crews on a wide platform overlooking the construction site. Before us stood the pyramid, larger than anything I had ever dreamed possible when I first arrived as a young laborer. The polished casing stones reflected the afternoon sunlight so brightly that many of us had to shield our eyes. The monument no longer resembled a mountain of rough blocks. It stood with smooth, shining sides that seemed to rise directly toward the heavens. For a long time no one spoke. Thousands of workers simply stood together, looking at the result of years of shared effort. Farmers, quarrymen, rope makers, stone masons, carpenters, scribes, cooks, physicians, priests, and laborers had all contributed something to this single creation. No one could point to one stone and say, "That alone is my work." Instead, every part belonged to all of us. The high priest stepped forward and offered prayers of gratitude to Ra for the light that guided our days, to Ta for the wisdom of craftsmen, and to all the gods who, we believed, had protected us through years of difficult labor. Incense drifted gently across the platform while the evening breeze carried its fragrance into the desert. When the prayers ended, the chief architect spoke in a calm voice that reached every corner of the gathering. He thanked us not only for our strength but also for our discipline, patience, and willingness to trust one another. He reminded us that monuments were not built by powerful rulers alone. They were built by countless ordinary people whose names might never be remembered but whose work would endure for generations. As I listened, I thought about everything I had experienced. I remembered my very first morning walking nervously toward the construction site before sunrise. I remembered the endless hauling of limestone blocks across damp sand, the rhythm of the drums guiding our steps, and the songs that helped us pull together as one. I remembered the quarry where the mountain slowly surrendered its stone. The master craftsmen shaping each block with incredible precision, and the physicians treating tired workers with honey and linen bandages. I remembered the festivals when music filled the village, the evenings spent laughing with my family, and the quiet nights when I stood beneath the stars looking at the growing pyramid. Every memory was now hidden inside these stones just as surely as the marks left by our tools. When the gathering ended, the workers slowly returned to the village. Some talked excitedly about future projects that would build more temples and tombs across Egypt. Others spoke about returning to their farms when the Nile flooded again. Life would continue, just as it always had. New children would be born. Old workers would retire. Kings would come and go. Yet I believed the pyramid would remain, watching silently over the desert through every season. Travelers from distant lands would one day stand before it and wonder how such an enormous monument had been created. They might imagine giants, magic, or impossible machines. Few would think about the thousands of ordinary men and women whose daily efforts made the impossible become real. That evening I walked home more slowly than usual. My children were no longer small enough to run toward me. They had grown into strong young people with dreams of their own. My wife smiled as she always had, though the years had added gentle lines around her eyes. We shared a simple meal beneath the evening sky, and for a while no one spoke. There was no need for many words. We understood what this day meant. My family had carried the burden of my long absences, my exhaustion, and my aching muscles just as surely as I had carried stone. The pyramid belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. Before sleeping, I stepped outside one final time. The moon shone brightly over the desert, covering the pyramid with soft silver light. The monument stood in perfect silence, unmoving and eternal. I placed my rough hand against a small limestone block near the path and closed my eyes. The stone felt cool beneath my fingers. It was only one block among millions. Yet without it the pyramid would not be complete. I smiled because I finally understood something that had taken me many years to learn. A person's greatness is not measured by how much of the world he carries alone, but by how faithfully he carries the small part entrusted to him. Tomorrow another generation would continue building Egypt, just as we once had. As for me, I was content. My hands were worn, my body was tired, but a part of my life would remain here forever, written not with ink on papyrus, but with sweat, skill, friendship, and countless stones rising together beneath the endless Egyptian sky.